On Memorial Day, May 25th, 2020, the city of Minneapolis became the epicenter of a tragedy that would reverberate around the world. This is a story of George Floyd, a black man, a moment, and a movement, the criminal justice aftermath that followed. George Floyd was 46 years old on the day of his death. He had fentanyl in his system and was under the influence. He had been driving like that. He was accompanied by his friend, Maurice Hall. Both were headed to buy cigarettes. The two attempted to use counterfeit $20 bills at a local cup food store in Minneapolis. Maurice Hall's transaction was rejected, but Floyd's was accepted. A 17-year-old cashier had suspected this dollar of being fake. Another cashier who was 19 years old reviewed the $20 bill and determined that it was indeed fake. Both told their manager. The manager then went outside and asked for the cigarettes back, complaining about the fake dollar. But George Floyd refused to, so the manager called the cops. Officers Thomas Lane and J. Alexander Keene, both trainees of the Minneapolis Police Department, arrived on the scene. They approached Floyd, who would go on to resist arrest. After being handcuffed, he continued resisting, and putting him inside a squad car was so hard. Thomas Lane called for help, and soon, one of the most brutal law enforcement encounters would occur in this city, Minneapolis, Minnesota. The most gruesome not only within the state, but in the world in history. Minneapolis Park police officer Peter Chan responded to help secure the scene. His job was to guard Floyd's vehicle and prevent his friend Maurice Hall from fleeing. Ultimately, Maurice was not arrested, as police determined there was not enough probable cause to charge him in this counterfeit case. Maurice provided Chan with a fake ID. When Floyd refused to get into the police cruiser, two more officers arrived, Derek Chauvin and Tu Tao. As the struggle escalated, the officers brought Floyd to the ground. Officer Chauvin placed his knee on Floyd's neck, something he was trained to do with criminals resisting arrest like George Floyd. Minutes later, George Floyd fell unconscious. In a recording filmed by a 16-year-old girl, as well as more recordings by other people surrounded, witnessing this law enforcement encounter, George Floyd can be heard saying, "I can't breathe." And Derek Chauvin told him that by talking, he is using a lot of air. So, Chauvin believed that the "I can't breathe" message was mental manipulation. And even before being placed on the ground, before having that neck be on him, George Floyd was already saying "I can't breathe" when resisting. As he fell unconscious, he was transported to the Hennepin County Medical Center, where he was pronounced dead that same day. Also on that Memorial Day, the now infamous video of George Floyd's arrest went viral, mainly on TikTok, sparking protests across the globe. Derek Chauvin and Tu Tao were fired, as the witnesses who had filmed this had gone to the Minneapolis police station, their headquarters, to report what had happened. The other two officers, Lane and Keene, were suspended. Only Officer Peter Chan did not face discipline. Eventually, Lane and Keene were fired as well. George Floyd's funeral was held at the Buies Funeral Home in Silver City, North Carolina. visitation occurred on June 6 at the Cape Fear Conference Building in Rayford. He was laid to rest at the Houston Memorial Gardens in Pearland, Texas. Following George Floyd's death, the legal machinery activated fast. Derek Chauvin was arrested on June 29, 2020, at a property where the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension had been hiding him. He was first taken to the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office, and then he was moved to the Ramsey County Jail for safety. He faced charges of third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. Attorney Eric Nelson entered not guilty pleas on his behalf. This attorney had met with him both at the hidden property and at the sheriff's headquarters. Therefore, Derek Chauvin was ready to enter a plea in his first court appearance. On the other hand, J. Alexander Keene and Tu Tao were arrested in separate secret locations. Keene was represented by attorney Thomas Blunkett and Tao by Robert Powley. Thomas Lane turned himself into the Hennepin County Sheriff's headquarters with his lawyer, Errol Gray. All three defendants arrested after Chauvin got private lawyers. When Lane walked into the headquarters, Keene and Tao were already in there. The three of them were afterwards booked together in the Hennepin County Jail. There had been riots throughout the country in protest of this incident, protesters demanding that the four officers be charged. And due to that happening, after all the destruction, all the looting, the gruesome nature of those riots, that is what happened. These four officers were charged and the riots would end. That friend of George Floyd, Maurice Hall, he was arrested in Houston, Texas after leaving a restaurant where he had a family dinner. After briefly being held at the Houston police station, he was booked into the Harris County Jail on unrelated open warrants from Minnesota. Hall waived extradition on June 2nd, 2020, in front of Judge David Fleischer. He was sent back to Minnesota and held in the Redwood County Jail. The state criminal investigation of George Floyd's death, led by Hennepin County prosecutor Amy Sweeney, had reached a probe. Prosecutor Sweeney secured grand jury indictments through a long meeting with the grand jurors of the Hennepin County District Court. Derek Chauvin, who had initially been booked on third-degree manslaughter and third-degree murder, was indicted on an extra charge of unintentional second-degree murder. The other three were indicted on aiding and third-degree manslaughter, both felonies. Later, prosecutors Anders Falk, Pamela Carlin, and Samantha Treppel would secure another indictment later on. This was for a federal criminal probe presented at the Minneapolis federal court. A grand jury at that court indicted each officer on 2 civil rights violations. Now, let's discuss first appearances. On May 30th, the day after Derek Chauvin's arrest, before Judge Louis Bartolome on a phone call, Derek Chauvin pleaded not guilty to his initial charges. His defense attorney would then submit paperwork to the court, publicly informing that he would plead not guilty to the extra indicted charge as well. In June 2020, on the third day, the remaining 3 charged officers made their first court appearance. At this point, the indictments were already unsealed. They too appeared on the phone. Before Judge Louis Bartolome, bonds were set for all 3 officers at $1 million. Earlier, Derek Chauvin had received a $1.5 million bond. Days later, with organizational funding, Thomas Lane was bonded out of jail. Then, days after that happened, J. Alexander King, too, was bonded out of jail. About 2 months later, Tu Tao was bonded out of jail. Then, in October that year, Derek Chauvin was bonded out of jail. Derek Chauvin, after his first court appearance, had actually not been held in county jail. He was at the Oak Park Heights prison for safekeeping. Meanwhile, Maurice Hall made his first court appearances as well. He appeared virtually from jail via Zoom before Judge Patrick Rowland. He faced 6 felonies and 1 misdemeanor, mostly drug and sex-related offenses. He was later moved to the Hennepin County Jail for a separate ammo possession charge, one in which he pleaded not guilty to before Judge Peter Cahill. Derek Chauvin and his wife Kelly made viral headlines as they were charged in a separate tax fraud case in Washington County, both facing 9 felonies. They too initially pleaded not guilty. However, Kelly would later go on to reach a deal and plead guilty. She was sentenced to 20 days in jail, but for a community service program, she avoided the jail time. And then Derek Chauvin took a plea deal as well, pleading no contest to the tax evasion. He received 13 months in prison, time served. This was a while after the outcome of the George Floyd related cases. The same private lawyers of the 4 officers in the state case would as well defend them in the federal case. George Floyd's family sued the city of Minneapolis and reached a $27 million settlement in March 2021. There were also separate federal lawsuits against the city and Derek Chauvin for other neck restraint incidents. These were via other victims. The city settled it with $600,000. The settlements were all completed by February 2025. The friend of George Floyd, Maurice Hall, was tried in February 2024 for his Redwood County case, convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He has appealed and that is pending. He as well pleaded out of the other cases. He pleaded guilty in Hennepin County to ammo possession and was sentenced to 60 months at the St. Cloud State Prison. He appealed that case too, a matter that was denied in July 2023. Maurice remains in that facility to St. Cloud. Now, back to the George Floyd related cases. This friend, Maurice, had not admitted that what they had done, hanging with a fake dollar, was indeed a misdemeanor. As he had bonded out of jail, he kept ignoring the fact that George Floyd resisted, that he had been under the influence of drugs, and really, the drugs were what brought him closer to the Grim Reaper, closer to death. Honestly, he had died of a drug overdose, or of a combination of factors. The knee and the neck due to his drugs, and due to him resisting arrest. He could not resist the lack of any small amount of oxygen and ended up dying. That was all due to the drugs he had done that day. In February 2021, Derek Chauvin was put on trial. It took a while for a jury of 12 members and 2 alternates to be seated. This trial officially kicked off the following month. Then, on 4/20 in 2021, April 20th, guilty on all 3 charges. Judge Cahill had refused to acquit him. The following month, that judge would refuse to redo the trial. In June of that year, Judge Cahill sentenced Derek Chauvin to 22.5 years. He only received the sentence for third-degree murder, and the remaining 2 convictions were vacated. He would remain at the Oak Park Heights State Prison to do his time. He was remanded into custody right after the guilty verdict. In November of that year, Derek Chauvin would take a plea deal in the federal case in order to be moved out of state prison. He could not stand the harsh conditions in there. He pleaded guilty to the civil rights offenses. With that deal, he waived his right to appeal. However, he did appeal the state case. But unfortunately, in 2023, the Minnesota Supreme Court affirmed his conviction and refused to grant him a new trial. Later that year, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear his case. The rest of the appellate matters remain pending. Hopefully, he could get a pardon, or the Innocence Project could be involved. In June 2022, Derek Chauvin was sentenced to 21 years in the federal case. That meant a few extra years in prison. However, this time would be served concurrently in a federal prison. Therefore, he was moved out of Oak Park Heights. He was initially held at the Tucson, Arizona federal prison, but after a gang member stabbed him, he was moved out of there to the Oklahoma Federal Transfer Center, and then he got placed inside the Big Springs, Texas federal prison, his current facility. He remains locked up to this day. President Donald Trump has mentioned pardoning him, but no action has yet been taken regarding that. In January 2022, three of the officers, Lane, Keene, and Tao, were put on trial for the civil rights offenses in federal court. The following month, they were found guilty on all charges. In April of that year, Thomas Lane was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. Due to him having had a child, he did not want to miss out on most of his life. Therefore, he reached a plea deal in the other state case. In May of that year, pleaded guilty to the manslaughter charge in order to have the abetting offense dropped. Then in September, even later on that year, Judge Peter Cahill sentenced him to 3 years in prison, extending his time. At this point, the three were not yet in custody, as in their first appearance for the federal case, Magistrate Becky Fornson had not made any more bond adjustments, depriving them from their temporary freedom. Prosecutors attempted to resentence Derek Chauvin, but Judge Cahill rejected that. They as well tried to resentence the other officers, but eventually gave up and withdrew those appeals. The resentences was to give them more prison time. In August 2022, J. Alexander Keene was sentenced in federal court to 3 years in prison, and Tao to 3.5 years in prison. Federal Judge Paul Magnuson ordered that they surrender by October of that year. The officers would turn themselves in directly to their assigned federal prison in September of that year. That is enough for the first part. Stay tuned to part 2, coming right up. Now for part 2. Thomas Lane surrendered to the Englewood Federal Prison in Littleton, Colorado, where Columbine happened. There he did his time. He was released on August 20th, 2024. Then, a month after that, the other two officers surrendered to their prisons to start their time. Tu Tao to the federal prison in Lexington, Kentucky, and Keene to the federal prison in Elton, Ohio. The three appealed that federal case. Most matters remain pending. However, the federal conviction of Tu Tao was rejected. In February 2024, I will continue covering those matters later on. J. Alexander Keene and Tu Tao still had their state case pending, the very last case we would hear of, regarding George Floyd. In October 2022, on the first day of trial, J. Alexander Keene took a plea deal and pleaded guilty to the manslaughter charge in order to have the aiding charge dropped. Therefore, immediately after making such a decision, he was driven back to Ohio by U.S. Marshals. Meanwhile, Tutau stayed in Minnesota. He was booked into the Hennepin County Jail to await a verdict for the state case. He refused to take a plea deal, and that verdict would be deliberated by Judge Cahill, who, without listening to testimony, would review evidence until he made a decision. In May the following year, Tutau was sentenced to 57 months in prison. He was convicted by Judge Cahill in May 2023 and sentenced in July. In his federal case, in August 2022, he had received 3.5 years and Keene 3 years. In December 2022, Keene received another 3 years. All terms would be run concurrently and in federal prisons. Tao was returned to his Kentucky facility. Keene was released in January 2025, and Tao on December 8th, 2025, a few days ago. Thank you for listening to this episode of Strawberry Ink. It was a difficult one to discuss. I wish everybody the best. And rest in peace, George Floyd. Thank you for listening. Take care. Have a good rest of your day.